I'm your host, Evan Hill, along with Matt Sprague. Our voices may sound a little bit familiar if you listen to the Connecting Construction podcast, but once again, super excited about the topic we are going to discuss today, the presenters we have on board, and at the end, the panel discussion that we will have. So before we dive in, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague Matt Sprague to go over a couple of items, and then I'll finish it up with some housekeeping items, and then we'll dive right in.
Great. For me, the only thing that I'm really responsible for in this webinar, I get off fairly easy, is I'm going to be manning the question portal. So I just want to draw attention to make sure that everybody in their GoToWebinar dashboard, they know where they can ask questions of the presenters. So I'll be there kind of queuing them up, and then I'll pop back in at the end of the presentations to start to provide these questions back to our presenters and get them all answered. But please don't hold your questions to the end. If you have a question that pops up, type it in and I'll put it in the queue. And what we will commit to is that if we don't get to answering all of the questions, we will get answers for you post-webinar. That's it for me.
Cool, thanks, Matt. So a couple other quick housekeeping items before we get started. This webinar will be recorded and it will be accessible on demand. So if you have to tune out, halfway through to another commitment or conflict, totally fine. We will send this to your email and it will also be accessible on the EBuilder website. Don't worry if you have to miss the end or something like that. Second item, you will receive a certificate of completion for attendance and participation once the webinar is complete. Again, that will be sent to your email following the conclusion of the webinar. And then finally, just to emphasize what Matt said, please ask questions. Questions have been a really thorough hit for almost every webinar we've done. We have an exciting panel discussion at the end after a couple of quick presentations. And personally, that's what I look forward to most in these webinars is the panel discussion at the end. Matt will be reviewing those very closely and thoroughly, so don't miss out on an opportunity to get your question asked or answered by a subject matter expert. So with that said, let me introduce a couple of our presenters. I will introduce them very briefly, and then I will let them do the rest of the talking, since I'm sure everyone is absolutely sick of hearing me talk. Our first presenter is Tolly Justice, our program director at EBuilder. He is going to provide several high-level concepts and a roadmap for the owner organization. And then we have Wendy Kaziki, the Associate VP of Controls, Finance, and Administration at USC. She will be providing the customer's perspective on cost management. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Tolly, who will dive into his presentation, and then after that, we'll hand it over to Wendy. Thanks, everybody.
All right, awesome. Well, again, my name is Tolly Justice, Program Director here with EBuilder. So I'm going to start today with kind of an overview of capital program cost management, right? Current state, as well as PMIS state, right? So what we see versus what it could be. Let's jump right into it. So while we're focusing today on cost management, it is important to note, especially as we're comparing current state to working within a PMIS, that all of these concepts are intertwined, right? We have document management, cost management, approvals, workflows, scheduling, reports, processes, business practices. All of these things come together to a holistic solution. So while we're focused today on the cost management aspect, we will be touching on different sections and how they intertwine. Because you can't really not do that, right? It's all part of a single structured system. So just want to bring that to everyone's attention. Okay, so current state. So before we get into the data, where does this data come from? This comes from my own personal experience, both in the industry and in EBuilder, as well as my team's experience, which is tens of consultants, business analysts, project managers, product managers, who all have day-to-day interaction with our hundreds of clients, and have brought them from this current state into a PMIS solution, right? So when we talk about these pain points and this current state that we're looking at, that's where that comes from, right? So when we look at overall capital cost management, we look at 3 sections of cost: portfolio management, project management, and field management, right? And the different types of costs that you're looking at within each of those. When we look at portfolio management, we're really talking about the executive level cost details, right? This is very, very high level cost, usually where a cost entity is represented by the whole project, or sometimes multiple projects in a program, or a single component of cost. Maybe that's broken down to a phase detail, but often they're trying to look at it across a portfolio, across multiple levels of cost. Usually, there are only 2 ways of getting this data in current state, right? Either we pull it out of a system that's managing accounting, like an ERP, or we're manually accruing that data in some kind of a collection, right? And then displaying it through a report. And I'm sure that sounds familiar to many of you. The next level down, we look at project management cost, right? This is the cost level that allows a project manager to deliver a scope, right? This is where we start to get into our project budgets, right? And the contracts, the whole contracts that make up or go against those budgets to deliver the terms of that project. Our most common vehicle for managing this cost that we see, spreadsheets. So many spreadsheets, tons and tons of spreadsheets. And it's very, very common, right, in what we call the current state. And then the last level down from that, what's populating those spreadsheets, right, is the field management. This is day-to-day cost management through tasks, right? This is where schedule gets integrated. This is line items against the contract. This is payable deliverables from the daily site reports into pay apps. This is all of the day-to-day transactions that actually create dollars and create scope, right? Create things in the ground, in construction. And that's managed on top of some spreadsheets, but primarily through paper, right? A lot of physical payment applications, a lot of physical change orders, a lot of schedules that are cost loaded at the line item, right? And deliverables that generate up into the project management spreadsheets, right? So when we have these 3 levels of information, these 3 levels of detail, how is all this information being moved around, right? As we see through the arrows, people. It's people doing work. It's people accumulating that data. It's people sorting through that data, aggregating it, and moving it to different sections. It's all somebody got to do it. So what are our risks with that? Number 1, data integrity, right? If we move data around through different people, people put their hands on it, it's playing a game of telephone, right? And every time we transition that data, we risk something being lost. We risk a mistake being introduced into the equation. After that, we've got variation. Everyone needs, in that scenario, needs to look at the data a little bit differently to do their job, right? But what they're going to do when they have the capability to do so is they're going to align whatever structure they're using to manage their section of work and their job with what makes it easiest for them. And that's good for the individual and the one item you're doing. It's really bad for the holistic approach of getting all of this to speak the same language, right? And what we end up with is a ton of data variation. Next item there would be the value of the data. We talked a lot about all the hands touching it, right? All the time with clients. How many people have to get involved to get a report from the field all the way up to the executive or the portfolio level? The time that it takes to do that can really diminish the value of that data in the first place. The data becomes old, becomes stale, becomes irrelevant. Also, the amount of time and resources it takes to actually do that aggregation is a serious strain on the organization. And then lastly, you usually have to retype that data many, many times, from physical documents into one spreadsheet, into another spreadsheet, into some kind of an aggregator, into a new report, into the ERP. You're typing the same information in over and over and over again, right? So what I have on the right of the screen here is a pretty simple project controls mantra, right? Monitor, analyze, correct. Very, very simple concept that general risk mitigation is based on. And every single one of these risk items eats into your ability as an organization to do that, right? every single one of those risks actually exacerbates your overall risk and your ability to mitigate. And that's where we want to come in with the next step. So what does this same need look like through a project management information system, right? What we need to focus on at the top level is that the whole purpose of the cost management through a PMIS is to have a single structure with multiple levels and variants of detail, right? So instead of having 3 pieces that need to be communicated, we have one cost structure. And what we're going to do with that cost structure is we're going to stratify it into needs, right? So instead of starting at the top, I'm going to start at the bottom. So field management, what we would call cost level 1. What is the need? I need variance, right? Every project is going to execute a little differently. Every contract is going to execute a little differently. They're going to have a different scope. I need the workers in the field to accomplish their day-to-day, right? And record all of that and not be beholden to a structure that doesn't work for all projects. I need to be able to build in that variance. But then when I roll that up into level 2, I need to attach that variance to consistency at the project level, right? So now my individual line items of the contract, for example, are all different, but they roll up into how all contracts on that project are measured equally, right? And we start getting into standardization and construction best practices. The other component that this is doing is because I'm working in the same cost structure, nobody is transitioning that data. There's no translation. The system is translating it by working and doing the field work in the system. It's being automatically aggregated up to the project and into the project management tasks. From there, we move up to the top level, and the same function is happening. Because all of the projects are now working consistently, the portfolio level cost, or the highest level of detail, now is uniform across the entire portfolio, right? Again, because the data is being done and the work is being, or the data is being input, I apologize, the work is being done in the system, there is no aggregate function. The second that the work is entered into the system, the real-time executive reporting, that is the roll-up of that work across the portfolio, is also available. And at this time, we're going to stop looking at what happened and start thinking about what's going to happen with our cost. Right, so talk a little bit in that previous slide about the advantages, right? That real-time access to data, the allowing the effective comparison of the entire portfolio for efficiency and performance gains. At the project level, we're really looking at the effective mitigation of risk, right? As opposed to responses to risk that is now realized. Streamlining and standardizing the processes that control the cost, which is building in those key project standardizations across all projects, reducing or eliminating the duplicate effort and entry, increasing the project performance metrics, and then down at the field, again, more into the processes discussion that are driving those cost items, but we're still allowing the variation necessary to maintain a robust construction portfolio with a lot of different project types happening simultaneously. All right, so that all sounds great. It's like, awesome. If it was so easy, everyone would do it. And it is true. It is a long path to go from the current state of doing everything in segments and projects in segments into doing everything through a single structured PMIS. The important part in that path is that it is not all or nothing, right? When we talk about that path, we're talking about a life cycle. There are steps involved in that life cycle. And if you're thinking you can't get, or you can't see how you get from point A to point Z in that life cycle, the truth is, 1, you do it in pieces, and 2, you don't necessarily have to bite it off all at once, right? Every time you take one step in that direction and you grow within PMIS cost management, you're going to get more of those values, but that doesn't diminish the fact that if you just took one step, you're going to see great value from that, right? So when we look at these concepts, just taking the step of introducing a portfolio-wide cost structure with doing nothing else would allow you to do real-time reporting at every level and reduce duplications and while allowing variations, and you could stop there until your organization was comfortable with it. That would be value commensurate with what it takes to get done. Then you can take the next step and say, okay, now we're ready for workflows, forecasting. How do we start using this data, using this real-time strategy to get ahead of the problem, right? Allowing us to streamline and standardize, allowing that increase in our performance metrics. After you settle into that world, you can start looking at how do we get our external users involved? Now this is outside of our organization. How do we look at integrating components of cost in schedule? And now we're working at true cash flowing, right? And started to build in other modules to, again, efficiently use resources and allow effective comparisons and true risk mitigation, all the way up to a fully integrated system that talks to other systems, completely eliminates duplicate entry, and you're looking at full automation, right? That life cycle moves along the path in pieces and stops when you need to stop, your organization needs to stop, take a break, and then get ready for your next step across that path. So how do we do that? What do you need to prepare? What do you need to think about if you're looking at introducing a PMIS? The biggest thing from an implementation perspective that I can share with my team is getting your team ready, right? Are you building a team? Do you understand what it takes and how a PMIS should be implemented, not just for cost, but for any structure? So here's a basic guideline of what a team should look like from the client perspective. Every team has to have an executive sponsor. Every ship has to have a captain. Every organization has to have someone that can champion the change, because let's face it, change is hard. And we can espouse all of the value in the world associated with what we're going to do with the change. Change is hard. People don't like it, right? There are going to be areas where the change is, the value is so great that that conversation is easier, that organizational change is easier, and there are going to be areas where that is not the case, and we are going to need top-down direction from that executive sponsor that the short-term pain now is absolutely worth the long-term value gain. And it's usually not just one executive sponsor, right? Especially when you take cost. Cost is a key area where our business unit and our finance unit collide, right? So the business executive sponsor may be on board. Yes, this is what we need. This is how we're going to do it. If the finance executive sponsor isn't in alignment, you're going to go off the rails very, very early, right? You need associated executive stakeholders to have maybe not the same voice, but the same directives within that executive sponsor, and to control their associated teams and get them on board with the upcoming changes, right? Once you have your executive team ready to go, now you can look at what is your day-to-day team build out, right? Your champion, your person that's going to own this implementation, that's going to drive it, that's going to spend the most time doing it. Your core team members, this very small, cannot stress, small team of people that they should contain roughly 95% of the business knowledge you need to get your implementation off the ground within that small team, right? This, from our experience, gives you the least impact to your day-to-day business while providing the most value to the implementation. If your team gets too big, not only can you have dissension, can you have problems, can you introduce slowness in your own implementation, but you're detracting from the work that they're hired to do, right? Because in no case, in my experience, have we walked into an organization that said, hey, we hired all of these people just to implement your product. These are people who have other jobs and they're going to be implementing your product as well, right? That's a real scenario. So we want to minimize that impact as much as possible. All right, then to cover that gap, you have your subject matter experts. This is a much larger pool of people that are pulled into as needed, right? We may have that 5% knowledge gap. We need to talk about very, very intricate details of a cost integration. We want to talk to that subject matter expert just to ensure and get into the nitty gritty, as we call it, of what those core team members might not know. So in addition to your team, you should have a strong implementation plan, right? Or be provided with one. Won't go into all the details of this side. The point here is there has to be a plan forward, and every single one of these phases, as we call them, has to be hit. We have to plan for it, we have to commence it, We have to look into what we're doing through discovery. We have to figure out how we're going to fix it through design. We have to actually build it through configuration, test it with the client, with the user base, make sure the value is being recognized, effectively train, and then monitor the adoption, rinse and repeat, right? Every single one of those chevrons that we saw earlier and the steps you want to take should go through this entire process to deliver results. So that's a lot. That's a lot of work. It sounds very, very daunting, even in the steps. So what I'd like to do now is to introduce you all to someone that has gone through it, right? And that is my friend Wendy, who has brought USC through this entire life cycle in these steps and can talk to you a lot about how she did it, what USC's journey was, and where they are now and what they're accomplishing in real terms of dollars and cents because of it. So with that, I will hand it over to Wendy.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Wendy Kazicki from the University of Southern California, also known as the University of Summer Construction. Today, I'm going to kind of go through an overview of how we came to choose EBuilder, why we chose EBuilder, and then go into how we implemented it and then integrated it, and then walk you through the cost summary module in EBuilder and to show you how doing your day-to-day work will then populate so that you can then analyze your projects on a cost basis, some of the reports that we use, and some of the forecasting that we're doing. So how did USC come to be using a project management information system like EBuilder? It started back in about 2010. The president was undergoing a very large capital campaign to bring in a lot of money for projects. And they recognized that they were going to have a change in the makeup and the complexity of the project. So you see we have almost $100 million of expenditures in fiscal year 11. So what happened was they had an audit of capital construction, and that audit determined that there was a need for policies and procedures, and that we needed to implement a PMIS. And so we went out, looked at different PMISs, and EBuilder was selected in June of 2011. Now, I wasn't there at the time, so they went ahead and they brought EBuilder on board, and they started working on the basic day-to-day kind of things that you do in EBuilder. And management changed in 2013, and that's when I was brought on board. Okay, so I was brought in by the new boss, and he said, "You're using this thing EBuilder, but I don't know if it's the right tool. I don't know if we should still use it. So why don't you come and tell me whether it's the right tool to use?" So I went and I looked at EBuilder, and I said, yes, that's definitely the right tool for us to use. And the reasons is it had a very good document storage system. They had good collaboration. They had the ability to have it very secure between what the contractor could see and what the owner could see, the architect. It had all the necessary functionality. People just weren't using it. And it was highly adaptable. We manage 400 projects a year, ranging from under $50,000 a year to well over a few hundred million, our largest project being 600 million. It was easy to develop reports, especially multi-project reports. It was easy to export data, and it continuously upgrades because it's a cloud situation. So once I determined it was the right product to use, how do I get the teams to use it? Well, the first thing I noticed was training. We had a good trainer. She was very knowledgeable. She talked a lot when she did her training, and her training sessions had too much information in them. If you're going to train something and you're going to talk, people might retain maybe 10% of what you tell them. If you have hands-on training, they might retain 25%. So what I determined was we should be training in smaller groups and smaller amounts of information, maybe 2 hours at a time, and then let them go back and start using the product, and then introduce the next more complex functionality of the product. Also, some of the workflows were extremely complicated. In fact, just the create a project workflow was so complex, we probably would have finished the project before we'd even get it approved by the workflow they had provided. Improving the forms and reports. Sometimes the first thing you do when you implement is people create all the forms that they have, and it turns out you don't really need to do that. Once you create proper workflows, a lot of the information is contained there and you no longer need those forms. Make corrections. A lot of times users would come and say, this doesn't work, or I can't see that. That was one of the things that was frustrating to them because people weren't taking the time to make those corrections. And staffing. Our project managers were cradle to grave, and they had no help at all. They had no office engineers, no project engineers. The first thing I did was hire a doc control technician that was going to do scanning for them and attaching documents that freed them up to do the more technical aspects of project management. And then to do integration, because that would provide a system where our managers could do cradle to grave all in one place without having to look in multiple locations. So as a brief overview of what we did to integrate, we have EBuilder, and we're integrating with our financial system for budgets. We're integrating with our procurement system for contracts, purchase orders, and invoices. We have a work order system that we integrate with, and we also do our project request and create projects through that system where our customers go out to request a project. And then there's a data warehouse where we've got check requests and JV transactions going through there. One thing to note, our procurement system would not allow us to integrate our purchase orders and our invoices from EBuilder to eMarket, our procurement system. So we still had to do duplicate entry. I'm going to go through the different sections of the cost summary so you can see how performing your day-to-day work will populate the information and then allow you to do analysis of how your projects are trending. I consider the cost summary as having 4 parts: a budget section, a commitment section, an actual sections, and a forecast section. In the budget section, original budgets will populate based on inputting into the module, and when they approve, they move into the original budget column. Then when you have a budget modification, that will show up in your pending budget change until it then gets approved, and it moves over into your approved budget changes column. Therefore, you then have a current budget. One thing that I stress to my project managers is if they're ever doing a budget mod where they're decreasing a line item, they always have to make sure that the budget is greater than commitments for that line item. The next section is the commitment section. And similarly, we have original commitments that are captured through the workflow that creates purchase orders and contracts. We have approved commitment changes that captures the purchase order revisions, change orders to contracts, amendments to contracts. Then we have a section called non-commitment costs, which I'll go over in a minute. And then the total current commitments. You capture your pending commitment changes while you're still working through your approvals for your purchase order revisions or your change orders. And you can capture change order proposals in there as well. Non-commitment items, those non-commitment costs that we capture here are journal vouchers, check request, and expense reports. I always used to call them non-paper commitments. They're items that get paid straight out, or for my journal entries, it's the PM fee I charge, or when I charge extra internal labor cost. It is when transportation charges me for parking spots where we have laydown areas that we're using for construction or for the dumpsters. Our check requests are mostly government check requests for permit fees or OSHPD fees. And then expense reports would be something like when our project managers travel to a meeting or a job site that's off campus and they file an expense report. These get captured in the non-commitment costs, and anything that's blue on the cost summary, you can drill down and you can say, hey, what is this $4,000 that's being charged to owner consultants? And then they can drill down and say, hey, that was for design review charges that happened back in 2016. The last section is a forecasting section, and that gets populated through the forecast module. That will give you an estimate of completion, so you can always compare what your project managers are forecasting the project to be versus what the budget is. And once you get more sophisticated and you get more consistency from your project managers in their forecast, then you can start creating metrics and a really nice graphic representation of the difference between your budget, your commitments, your actuals, and your forecast. The actual section uses the workflow for approving your invoices, and it will capture your actuals received and your approved and paid depending on where you are in the approval process. Next, I'm going to talk about reporting. We have a number of reports, and some of the reports that we find quite useful. We have exception reports where we can find exceptions to items, but we track our commitments and our invoices to make sure nothing gets stuck in a process, that an invoice isn't been submitted by a contractor or a consultant and it's not being processed. We have reports to show how long they've been sitting somewhere to make sure that they can get paid promptly, and the same with commitments and commitment changes. As you all probably experience, closing out a project takes a lot longer than we would want, but it's important for us to close out our projects financially and return any underruns to our customers. And so we developed a couple of closeout reports that help with that. This closeout summary compares the budget and commitments and shows what our current commitments versus the paid is, so that you can see that you haven't paid out all of your commitments, which means either somebody still owes you an invoice or you need to de-encumber and contact those vendors to see whether they're done invoicing or whether you can de-encumber your purchase orders. To identify who those might be, we have an open commitment report that basically shows everybody and how much is still left open in their contract. So this particular project was a very large project, and we still have $4 million to make sure that we close, and then we can close our project. There are different layouts that you can create. The layout that I had been going through is default all columns, where I went through all the columns. I tend to like to use one called an executive cost summary, because I approve all contracts, change orders, and amendments, and I always check to make sure that the commitments don't exceed the budget. Otherwise, I ask that they perform a budget mod, moving money out of contingency or another line item. And if there's not enough money, then I cannot sign the contract and they have to go back and ask for more money. But this particular layout is a cost summary with forecasted columns, and that gives you a good overview of your budget, commitments, and your forecast. So you have an over-under column at the end. Forecast module allows you to save and snapshot your forecast, so you can go back in time and compare how they might have been forecasting. Were they anticipating it going over budget? At what point is it getting worse? You can look and compare. But the forecast module itself, I think, is one of the easiest and the best forecasting module I've ever come across in the different products that I've used in the past. It allows you to put the pending forecasted items that aren't quite yet committed onto this forecast worksheet, and then you check the box if it's already in the budget, so you don't double count it. And once it gets committed, you would check the box, and then it takes it out of the forecast because you've already committed, and that way you're not double counting it. And if you're going to forecast something over budget, then you don't check the little budgeted box, and then it says, okay, now you're forecasting that particular item is going to be over budget by that amount. Some of the keys to a successful implementation, and I've got a list of them based on where you are in your implementation. Some of the earlier ones are having small victories, rolling out things in different items in order to get a small victory and a little buzz from your user base. But basically what you want to do is you want to provide an environment that your project managers can succeed. And by providing clearly defined policies and approvals, streamlining those approvals so that people aren't approving more than one time in the same process, developing what each person's responsibilities is in the team, it makes it clear and more consistent. And then by establishing effective procedures and controls, you're able to get that consistency of performance. Streamline those procedures, avoid the duplicate input, because somebody could have something different in your financial system than in your PMIS. So you don't want to create an environment where you're spending more time trying to evaluate why they're different instead of doing the work, thereby providing one single system where all the project information is handled. And part of the problem is sometimes we fail our employees. We haven't provided them with the right environment for them to be successful. And so it's really important that you can look at ways to make sure, are you giving them too much work? Are you giving them the right resources in order for them to have a successful project? What's the next steps for USC in terms of using EBuilder? As Tolly mentioned, you're never just done. You use the system, and as you get more familiar with it, you can see other uses. You can grow your sophistication in using it. And the one thing that once I got my project managers to be able to do forecasts, the next step is to actually use the cash flow capabilities of EBuilder. We would create scheduled templates, and we would use the cash flow module. Right now, our project managers cash flow on spreadsheets that get sent out to them and compiled. So there's multiple versions of spreadsheets based on each project manager that can compile into one capital plan. So once we can do that within EBuilder, we can then export that information instead of having to compile all that data. But on top of that, USC a few years ago decided they were going to change financial systems. And that financial system Workday is going to go live on July 1st, 2021. And they've been working on it for a couple years now. And we are right now in the process of redoing most of our integrations because our financial system's changing, our procurement system's changing. At first I was, can I win the lottery before I have to redo all these integrations? But now I'm kind of excited because we've looked at our workflows and we've determined some extra streamlining we can do. We will now be able to integrate our contracts and purchase orders straight from EBuilder into the financial system and our invoices. And we'll be able to use the contracts module in Workday, which will eliminate the need for creating a requisition and a purchase order, which used to confuse people a lot. So that's another exciting thing. And the other thing is we are now creating more metrics and dashboards that allow us to report the health of a project in a good snapshot to our customers, and to also oversee, our directors can oversee our project managers and get an idea if something's going bad early and help mitigate any risk or problems that we have earlier rather than later. So that's kind of an overview of how you can journey through the use of EBuilder and leverage some of the cost analysis features.
Thank you very much, Wendy. And Tali, you can share your face again. We'll hold off the questions until you show up. There we go. Awesome. So just kind of a few questions from the audience, and they really kind of take kind of looking at two different sides. One is much more of like the technical use of it, and the other one is part of the implementation side of it all. So the first one, and Wendy, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you actually have some experience from the other side of the coin in terms of the general contractor coming from Parsons, or if that was more on the consultancy side. But either way, the question was around, you know, how do the cost-related issues differ between an owner organization and a general contractor? You know, and do they interrelate? And then the last kind of part of that question is really, you know, why does an owner need their own solution to manage these type of things? So there's a bunch to unpack there.
Right. So, and I've actually been an owner, a CM, a contractor, and an owner again. So I've used PMISs from all different directions. When I was on the general contractor side, and it was my system, I was worried about my profit, and I was looking at my contract with my client and whether or not I was going to make money or not. And I was doing production tracking and forecasting that way. General contractors will use it to manage their subs. As an owner, I'm looking at whether I'm going to make the budget for my project and how do I, you know, develop a successful project for my customer. It doesn't just deal with construction. It deals with programming the information with my customer to make sure that I am developing a project that meets his needs. There's design, there's construction, there's permitting, there's inspections at the end that sometimes aren't even handled by the contractor. Like, for instance, if the Board of Health has to come out and look at a kitchen, you know, we've got a lot of stuff with OSHPD. So there's a lot more. And as an owner, you want to be the one who owns the documentation for the project. You don't want to rely on the contractor's viewpoint of what happened. So that's part of it. There was a second part of the project question, or is that it?
That was kind of it. You rolled it all together. Tal, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, when we see the difference between contractor and owner, right? And Wendy really hit on the concept of a contractor's focused on being profitable on that one scope of work, on that job. They're focused in, money out, right? The concept of accruals versus payments. The owner world is focused, if we look at it at the highest level, it's focused on an entire portfolio, which could be hundreds of contractors. That's where the win happens, right? If I can manage that entire portfolio at or under budget, I can do more with my money. I can get more federal funding next year. I can start projects that serve my constituency earlier. No general contractor or general contractor software is going to give you that level of information because they don't have it. They can only see what they're contracted to do.
Yeah, I was going to mention the same thing, is that we're looking at as you know, some people look at it as I've got $100 million and how do I prioritize against these projects, right? So you can look at and review where you're going to get the most thing, and you can use scheduling to prioritize. You can do calculations of who to assign your next project to because you're tracking the workload of your project managers in there. There's all sorts of things you can do to manage your program through the system besides just one project.
Cool. So another question, Wendy, specifically for you, is a question of start to finish, what was the total duration of the USC implementation? And I know you said you came in and they were already utilizing it, but I got the feeling there was kind of a re-implementation when you kind of, took it over?
Yeah, so they already had it online and people put projects in, but they weren't really utilizing it. We did a whole study. They might have been using it for documents. They might be using it for RFIs and submittals, but they weren't really using it. So so I'd say it probably was 3 years by the time we got it integrated, so that people really could see the benefits of doing everything in the system. And we started out as requiring them to do more. First, we made sure the budgets were fully in. Then we made sure that they were putting their approvals through. So we use the EBuilder processes to do all of our approvals of contracts and purchase orders. Our department approvals are there, and then the USC, when we have send it across the street so that the procurement department does it, that goes into the financial system under the USC approvals, but we get all of our approvals in the system. And the interesting thing is we do the same thing for invoices. So when COVID-19 hit and everybody started working remote, we already had a paperless invoice approval system that was pretty successful, and we were able to pivot on a dime and not really lose a step in our ability to process contracts and payments.
So you just mentioned a few of the workflows that helped simplify and streamline. So question came in, what other kinds of tasks were you eliminating by the use of workflows?
There were a lot of paper questions that had to be filled out. They called it a FAR form that with every purchase order that needed to be created, and those things no longer needed to be created separately because they were captured in the process. That's some of the things that stick in my mind the most. Is they had a duplication of what they were inputting plus this form that they were creating, and I came in, I said, you don't need to do the form anymore because it's already doing it for you in the system.
Charlie, this one I think kind of goes on from all of your experiences. So the question, statement/question was, public entities have multiple funds, budgets, and charge numbers. Is EBuilder able to categorize multiple projects under one budget and other projects under other budgets?
Absolutely, right. Very, very common. Obviously, large government has that a lot. Large universities have this a lot. Funding is something that Wendy would be very familiar with as well. Really, any large organization that is an owner that pulls in large amounts of money from different sources, it has to track where that money comes from and where it goes, because there's usually a lot of reporting requirements to show where that money went, right? And the audit requirements. So absolutely, we deal with that. That's a fundamental component of why a PMIS is so important, and usually a disconnect. We have many government clients that I have worked on personally that had that up to a point, right? The ERP system could tell you what projects got what dollars, and that was great. But how those dollars were utilized, how that filtered out to contracts, how those contracts filtered out to daily activities, and whether they were going to need more from those funds or not, completely fell short because ERPs don't speak construction, right? That's the whole purpose. And at the same time, to take the project managers and the day-to-day managers, the construction managers' spreadsheets, and roll those up into something that the ERP could understand was a monumental task that they frankly didn't have the manpower to do. So that was just the big knowledge gap, right? And that's what leads to the big cost for overruns, the running out of money for specific funding sources. If you're in the government space and you're listening, you probably have some kind of status in your organization called project on hold in some way, where all of a sudden, nobody saw it coming, but the fund ran out of money, and we can't keep working without going and asking the people who gave us the money in the first place for more. So now the project's on hold, the schedule's slipping, we're losing productivity. We have a couple of very large organizations. That was their number one pain, Just keep us out of on-hold status so that we can tell us when the funding, things happen in construction. We have change orders. Just tell us when we're within 85% of the source by fund so that we can get in front of that ask and at a minimum keep the project moving. If not, right size the project, right the ship, and eliminate that risk and not overspend.
So both this last question, and I think both of you somewhat hit on it, if not specifically hit on it during your presentations, but it would be a good way to kind of wrap this up. What would be your 1 to 3 key takeaways for a successful implementation? What are the most important pieces besides having coffee?
He's laughing because he's going to get more time to think about that. I think one of the more successful things that I heard in an implementation was when the users say, I can't imagine how we were doing without it before, and what used to take me an hour to do now takes 10 minutes. I mean, that is, and especially from somebody who is not the typical project manager type, for them to say that. Some of the other things is when we started implementing a new process where all of a sudden we were integrating and it was writing back information, when project engineers would come and say, hey, I noticed that new thing that was just there. That showed that they really were paying attention and they weren't just doing things because somebody told them, but they really were understanding what the system was doing for them.
All right, Tali, you're up.
All right, a couple of things that are critical to your implementation. Number one is your preparation, your team, your buy-in, right? Whatever you want to call it. If you don't walk into an implementation ready to fully participate, ready to put in the work, obviously anyone who implements here at EBuilder, we understand you have day jobs, right? We are hired to implement full-time. Wendy's hired to manage a construction portfolio and implement EBuilder, right? So we have to make valuable use of your time, but that time has to be there. You have to have the team that's ready to participate, to make decisions, and to execute. That's number one. Number two, understand the risks around and the needs around organizational change, right? And make sure the people that you're hiring to implement your software understand that as well. Change is hard. People do things their entire lives the same way. I remember when I was very, very young in EBuilder and on an implementation and doing my first training on how this new daily site report tool was going to be doing all this stuff through iPads. And it was the most amazing thing because I can remember being out on site in the blazing heat, writing this stuff down and how much of a pain it was. I was so excited. And there were a couple of people that had very adverse reactions and were a little rude to me, let's just call it that, about the idea of me eliminating their little yellow book. After being able to reflect on that for many years, I understand all that was fear because I was changing what they did for a living. I was changing their job, right? I was coming in and disrupting their lives. You have to have an organization that understands organizational change, that's a challenge, and has empathy for it, right? And understands that you have to establish the value, you have to get people to want to change, in addition to having a sponsorship around this is the way the ship is going, this is how we're steering. Those two items are the big problems. Everything else that's technical can be solved. Everything else of that is just working on solutions, figuring out little pains, providing little fixes. If you get those two big things right, your implementation will fall into place.
Well, awesome. So my counterpart, Evan, asked me to kind of close this out for us as he is having a cement delivery in his front yard right now. So perfect timing during the webinar. So he said it's rather loud. So he asked me if I could go through the details and making sure that everybody has everything they need at the end here. So number one, thank you to Wendy and to Tali for coming in and sharing your experiences with us. Absolutely fantastic. Second, We're going to be able to email this recording to anybody who not only showed up today, but also registered. So that'll be coming through and it'll be made available on demand on our resource page on our website. Within the chat, there will be a link to a blog post, as well as a brief survey question that essentially says, are you interested and you want to talk to somebody? Otherwise, we'll be nice and we'll leave you guys alone. Kind of, but we'll be in touch in other means. But if you need someone to talk to, we want to make sure that we get that to you right away. And that's pretty much it from us. Again, one more time, thank you so much for all that you did today, both of you, and thank you to everybody for showing up. Have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you very much. It's fun.
Bye-bye.
Bye.